AWCA, Mike Amori, welcome to the Week 7 4 p.m. update. I want to review the Mark Dvoretsky endgame that we looked at. This was taken from his fantastic endgame manual, and it's not really easy stuff. On the surface, when you first see these positions, it can be really hard and difficult because you're not exactly sure what you're looking for. So in his book, he just gives this as an exercise, and it tells you it's white to move with a question mark, meaning is it white to play and win? Is it a win for black? Is it a draw? Turns out it is a draw. However, to get to a draw, you have to solve this problem of dealing with this pin. Right? This is not an easy problem to solve. So if you play some natural moves to break that pin, so clearly you don't want to go into the corner and just hang the knight for nothing, because you can attack black's bishop, but the bishop's going to come to b6, and this f pawn is not long for this world, and pushing it I could just take with the rook, or just king g6, and this game's in big trouble, right? So if you put your king on h1, you're going to lose instantly. So what else is there to do? Well, go through them one by one. King g2. King g2 allows bishop to b6, just flat out attacking the rook. And once the rook moves, you'll see the knight is being attacked twice. So we can again use this concept of a check to get you in or out of trouble. So it appears you get out of trouble from the bishop, but after king g6, everything that white has is hanging. The rook is hanging, the knight on f2 is hanging. So clearly going back, putting the king on g2 is not going to work. So now we're down to two moves. King g1 here, or king g3. King g1 loses. And it loses to bishop to b6. Attacking the rook, and again putting all this pressure on f2. However, if you pause your video, hopefully you've got this set up at home, how can white use a check to get out of trouble twice? So you're only going to use one check, but you're going to get out of two different problems. And what are your two different problems? Your rook is attacked, and when it moves, the knight is attacked twice. So you should be able to find rook h5, check. Now once the rook gets attacked by the king, it can drop down to h2 to protect the knight. So you kind of solved two problems with one check, except it is black's move, and white is going to lose. You could just move the a pawn. You could just move this pawn, and you're going to win the game because the knight is pinned. You're going to trade everything off. The only thing with moving the a pawn is it might allow this rook to run up the board, just giving away the knight. And of course, you're still going to win that position, but it's like, why even let the rook stay in the game? It's probably much easier to just take the knight, and what does white do? I mean, they're almost forced to take. So when they take back, now you push the a pawn. Please do not push the a pawn one square. Please don't do that, because after king f1, you have to take the rook, otherwise you'll lose. King takes f2, a5, and you'll see that the king over here is going to be able to get into the square of the pawn. So you cannot move that pawn one box. You have to move it two. Okay, so as soon as that knight gets taken and you have this position, you play a5, keeping the pin on the rook. And now once the pin is broken, you take, king takes back, and a4. And again, I'll show you those highlights with the square of the pawn. It doesn't work. You guys see that variation? So here's our starting point, and that is why king g1 does not work. Bishop b6, the saving check. Well, it doesn't really save you. It just kind of saves you for a day or two. Rook h2, and now simply take the knight, and the game is finished. Correct? Okay. That leaves us with the move king g3. Now, after king g3, it's important that you pause the video and look at your own chessboard, and I'm giving you the answer pretty much. This move draws the game. But on the surface, you should still be fighting the idea of why can't the rook just take the knight on f2? Well, it can, and it does. It's the best move. You might as well take. But watch the difference here. Once you play that saving check, the king attacks your rook. What's the deal here? And keep in mind, after rook takes f2, you have to play that check. You can't play king f2 because you get pinned and you're going to lose the game here. You guys see that line? Yeah, just make sure you don't take the rook. So after rook takes f2, this little check is so resourceful because once the king moves, I think king g6 is the best move to play because you have to get on the white rook. If you blunder in this position and play king g7, now in this position it appears white is going to win the game because it's rook against bishop now. You start running that pawn and white can simply start centralizing the king, and moves like a4, once these pieces centralize, I mean, you can throw in a check, king's just going to centralize, a3, give a little check. That knocks the king back. You see why? Because you'll get double attack. So you just knock the king back, rook d6, attack the bishop, you push the pawn, and now I simply come get the pawn. There's no way for you to stop that rook from coming over, okay? So at your level, you should have no problem understanding this is a complete win for white. That's why after this rook check, you have to play king g6 and get on the white rook. Okay, so we're still kind of stuck here. How do we draw the game? What was white's idea? Well, stop the video. There it is. You attack the bishop. And by attacking the bishop, black is either going to lose the bishop, which would lead to a drawn rook and pawn ending, or they're going to protect their bishop. If they protect, it's very important that you find rook d6 check. Again, using a check to get out of trouble. King f5, and there's a draw on the board, but you still have to be careful. Did you hear that little warning sign in the background? Yeah, it means be careful. Rook takes bishop. Beautiful move. If the pawn takes, you simply take the rook down at the bottom, but that's not what white's going to deal with. White's going to have to deal with this rook takes f3. Absolute beautiful move. What do? They're just giving the rook away? Should you take it? Absolutely not. If you take that rook, they're going to take back. And now you have entered into a king and pawn ending where here's the pawn, the only pawn left on the board. Do you guys remember the rule that if a pawn is trying to become a queen, if it's on its own side of the board, there are 3 critical squares that the friendly king must be able to get to. Let me flip the board for you. You're playing black now. This is a winning position for black. If this black king can reach which squares? These. If I could reach any one of those squares, I win the game. And you will, because you have opposition. King moves over, you move over. And there's nothing white can do to prevent you from reaching one of those critical squares. You guys see this? That's it. Game's over. Once you take opposition, say the king comes here, you just play king a4, and you're on one of those critical squares. Game is over. Okay, once you got that line down, then you see that after this really nice check, the key move for white is not to take the rook. Just drop down to g2. And once you do that, now if the rook is taken up in the corner, as you can see, can you guys see this in your heads? Now if the rook takes, you take the rook with opposition. And I can just move these pieces by hand. It's the same exact pattern, but now we're looking at it from white's perspective. But the big difference is once they play this move, we play king b3, and there's no way for black to make progress. We just keep taking opposition. The minute the king drops back, we just come forward with opposition, and then they start the series of checks. We know from WCA lectures, anytime you can block the pawn, the game is a draw. So that's why after rook takes f3, we simply drop down to g2. Now, what if black says to white, hey, I'm going to keep the pawn, I'm going to play up a pawn and win this game? Well, the problem is there are a lot of ways to draw this as black. As white, one way is to just drop straight back on the file, and as they start to push the pawn, you just start bringing your king over, and there really is no way for black to make progress, because every attempt you make to push the pawn further down the board, the white king just keeps getting closer and closer until you get a position like king c2, and there's no way to make progress here. You start bringing your king down, and the rook will just cut your king off. Now, how to make progress? If you move your rook to h1, we just attack the pawn from the side. So what else is there? If they push the pawn, we just play king b2. And once the rook moves, you take the pawn and it's a draw. Okay? Very instructive. I hope you guys get a lot of sleep Saturday night for the simul, because I'm looking forward to lots of Amori victories.